The carriage wheels screamed against stone as they skidded toward the precipice, the ornate black lacquer catching moonlight one final time before plunging into the darkness of Devil's Throat Gorge. Inside, a man who had bought and sold human beings like cattle clawed at locked doors while his driver's whip fell uselessly into the void below. On the cliff's edge stood a woman with scarred wrists and eyes that reflected not fear, but decades of calculated patience finally reaching its conclusion. This is the story of how an enslaved woman named Carriage transformed her master's luxury carriage into his coffin, orchestrating one of the most shocking acts of resistance in 1852 Colorado territory. Before we dive deeper into this night of reckoning and retribution, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been erased from history books for over 170 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The August heat hung over Blackstone Ridge like a shroud, the kind of oppressive mountain air that made even breathing feel like labor. At 11:43 p.m. on August 17, 1852, the only sounds breaking the silence were the rhythmic clatter of iron-shod wheels against packed earth, and the labored breathing of two horses pulling a carriage worth more than most men would earn in a lifetime. The road hugged the cliff face with the intimacy of a lover's embrace, one side pressing against granite walls that rose 300 feet toward star-filled skies, the other dropping away into Devil's Throat Gorge, where pine trees looked like toothpicks from the rim and the Colorado River ran cold and merciless 1,000 feet below. Marcus Tharvin sat inside his custom-built carriage, its interior lined with velvet imported from France, its exterior painted in black lacquer that cost more than the combined value of the 17 human beings he claimed as property. His fingers drummed against a leather satchel containing deed transfers for a plantation expansion that would require 50 additional enslaved workers to cultivate tobacco fields stretching across 500 acres of stolen indigenous land. He was reviewing profit projections when the carriage lurched to a sudden stop. The year was 1852, and the Colorado Territory carried more than gold seekers and frontier dreams. It carried the screams of enslaved people forced westward by owners who saw expansion as opportunity, and human beings as investments that could be worked until they broke, then replaced with fresh purchases from auction blocks in St. Louis and Kansas City. Tharvin had built his fortune on this mathematics of cruelty, acquiring his first enslaved person at age 19 with money inherited from a father who had done the same. 32 years later, his holdings included 300 acres of prime Colorado bottomland, a mansion that rivaled anything in Denver, and human property valued at $47,000, according to insurance documents filed with territorial authorities. But tonight, his most valuable possession sat in the driver's seat, controlling horses that could mean the difference between reaching Silverton by dawn or plunging into darkness that offered no second chances. Carriage had been forced into Tharvin's ownership 8 years earlier, purchased at a St. Louis auction for $1,200 after her previous master died, leaving debts that required liquidating assets, human and otherwise. The bill of sale described her as female, approximately 28 years of age, experienced in domestic service and carriage driving, shows no signs of rebellious tendencies, suitable for household management or skilled labor. The assessment had been catastrophically wrong on one critical point. Her hands gripped the reins with strength built from 8 years of controlling horses along mountain roads, where a single mistake meant death for everyone in the carriage. Her arms bore scars from whippings administered for infractions that included looking a white overseer directly in the eyes, speaking without permission, and once, singing a song in a language Tharvin didn't recognize and therefore classified as dangerous. But the deepest scars were invisible, written in memories of a daughter sold away at age 6 to cover gambling debts, a husband worked to death in tobacco fields where summer heat killed slower than overseer brutality, a mother who had thrown herself into a river rather than endure one more day of systematic dehumanization disguised as economic necessity. From Tharvin's personal ledger dated August 1852, Carriage continues to demonstrate exceptional value as carriage driver. Her knowledge of mountain roads has proven invaluable for business travel. Recommend against sale despite recent offers of $1,800. Current utility exceeds potential profit. The entry revealed everything about how Tharvin viewed human beings, and nothing about the woman who had spent 8 years memorizing every curve, every precipice, every location where the road narrowed to widths that left no margin for error. She knew these mountains the way predators know hunting grounds, with intimate understanding that transcended maps drawn by surveyors who measured distance but never grasped the living geography of stone and space. Tonight's journey had begun 16 hours earlier in Denver, where Tharvin had finalized contracts for his plantation expansion. The route to Silverton normally required 2 days of travel, but Tharvin had insisted on night driving, eager to reach his destination before a rival bidder could secure water rights he needed for irrigation systems that would transform dry land into profitable agriculture, watered by the forced labor of people he would never recognize as human. Caliph had not argued. Enslaved people who argued found themselves sold to mining operations, where life expectancy measured in months rather than years. Or worse, to breeding farms, where women became production units valued only for their ability to create more property for masters who calculated profit margins in human births. She had simply nodded, harnessed the horses, and begun driving toward a destination she had no intention of reaching. The carriage had passed the last settlement 3 hours ago, a mining camp called Redemption Springs, where prospectors drank away their failures and success stories traveled faster than truth. The road beyond offered nothing except wilderness, punctuated by cliff faces that dropped into gorges bearing names like Devil's Throat, Widow's Drop, and Perdition Canyon, christened by survivors of accidents that left wreckage scattered across canyon floors like broken promises. Devil's Throat Gorge earned its name from the sound wind made when it screamed through the narrow canyon, a noise that miners swore sounded like damned souls calling from depths that offered no salvation. The gorge stretched for 3 miles along the route to Silverton, its walls rising vertically from a river that had carved this wound in the earth over millennia of patient erosion. The road along the rim varied from 12 feet wide in generous sections to barely 6 feet where rock outcroppings forced the path closer to the edge. Wooden posts marked the most dangerous curves, replacements for earlier markers that had rotted away or been knocked into the abyss by careless drivers who learned too late that mountain roads forgave nothing. Caliph had driven this route 17 times over the past 3 years. She knew where the road widened enough for 2 wagons to pass. She knew where spring runoff made the surface treacherous with mud that could send wheels sliding toward oblivion. Most importantly, she knew exactly where the road narrowed to its most dangerous point, a hairpin turn locals called the Devil's Elbow, where the cliff face pressed so close to the edge that drivers had to slow to a crawl and pray their horses didn't spook at the wrong moment. It was here, at 11:43 p.m. on August 17, 1852, that Caliph Dromer brought the carriage to a stop that would transform her from property to legend, from enslaved driver to architect of justice that recognized no law except that written in the hearts of people who had suffered beyond any measure that free people could comprehend. What would you do if freedom required destroying the only thing standing between you and a 1,000-foot drop into darkness? The territory that white settlers called Colorado in 1852 had been home to Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples for thousands of years, before European maps imposed names on landscapes that already possessed them. The mountains that prospectors saw as obstacles concealing gold were sacred spaces where generations had hunted, gathered, and maintained relationships with land that required respect rather than exploitation. But expansion waited for no one's permission, and by 1852 the westward surge had transformed the territory into a patchwork of mining claims, ranches, and plantations that imported the South's peculiar institution to frontier spaces that had never known institutional slavery until white settlers brought their human property along with their ambitions. Marcus Tharvin represented the new breed of Western slaveholder, men who saw untapped land as opportunity and enslaved labor as the key to unlocking wealth that would establish dynasties lasting generations. His father, Christopher Tharvin, had made his fortune in Kentucky tobacco before dying of consumption in 1847, leaving his eldest son $300,000, a plantation, and 43 human beings whose market value exceeded the land itself. Marcus had sold the Kentucky holdings within 6 months, liquidating everything except the people he claimed as property. The enslaved workers were forced westward in chains, their journey covering 800 miles over 4 months of travel that killed 7 of them before reaching Colorado Territory, where Tharvin established Blackstone Ridge plantation on land purchased from territorial authorities, who asked no questions about how he intended to farm it. The plantation sprawled across 300 acres of river-bottom land, its soil enriched by seasonal floods that made it ideal for tobacco cultivation. Tharvin had invested $40,000 in infrastructure, irrigation systems, curing barns, a processing facility, and a mansion that announced his arrival among Colorado's emerging planter class. But the plantation's true value lay in its labor force. By 1852, Tharvin owned 17 enslaved people whose combined market value approached $25,000 according to insurance policies that classified them as property, requiring protection against loss, injury, or death that would impact his financial position. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Killeth Dramier stood apart from the field workers who cultivated tobacco from dawn until darkness made further labor impossible. Her skills as a carriage driver made her uniquely valuable for business travel that required navigating mountain roads where mistakes proved fatal. Tharvin trusted her capabilities even as he denied her humanity, a contradiction that defined the entire system of slavery built on recognizing human intelligence while refusing to acknowledge human rights. She had been born in 1816 in Virginia, her earliest memories fragmented images of a mother who sang songs in languages that predated enslavement, melodies carrying memories of African homelands that existed now only in music that survived when everything else had been stripped away. Her father remained unknown, possibly the master who owned her mother, possibly another enslaved man whose name had been lost when families were separated by sales that treated human relationships as irrelevant to economic transactions. At age 6, Killeth had been sold to a Kentucky plantation owner named Robert Sullivan, separated from her mother during an estate liquidation that scattered families like autumn leaves. The sale document listed her as girl child, healthy, suitable for training in domestic service, valued at $250, less than Sullivan paid for a breeding mare the same week. Sullivan's plantation had taught her skills that would determine her survival: cooking, cleaning, sewing, and eventually carriage driving after the regular driver died when horses spooked during a thunderstorm and crashed into a fence post that crushed his skull. At 14, Killeth found herself controlling horses for a master who valued her abilities while denying her humanity, praise and punishment delivered with equal casualness by a man who never questioned his right to own other human beings. She married at 16 a fellow enslaved man named Daniel who worked Sullivan's tobacco fields and dreamed of freedom he would never live to see. Their daughter arrived in 1834, a girl they named Sarah after Daniel's mother, who had been sold south years earlier and whose fate remained unknown. For 2 years, Killeth experienced something approaching happiness, despite the chains that bound every aspect of her existence. Then Sullivan's gambling debts came due, and Sarah was sold to a Mississippi plantation owner who needed young slaves to train for domestic service. Killeth had screamed and fought and begged, degradations that accomplished nothing except earning her 20 lashes that left scars she still carried. Daniel had been forced to watch, his hands tied to prevent intervention that would have resulted in his own sale or worse. 3 years later, Daniel died in the tobacco fields during a heat wave that killed 4 enslaved workers in a single week. Sullivan noted the deaths in his ledger as financial losses requiring replacement purchases, calculating the cost of new slaves against the expense of providing adequate water and rest that might have prevented the deaths entirely. From a letter written by Marcus Tharvin to his business partner, dated March 1844, "I have acquired an excellent carriage driver at the St. Louis auction, a woman with demonstrated skills and no family attachments that might complicate her utility. The $1,200 price seems steep, but her abilities justify the investment. She will prove invaluable for my Colorado venture, where skilled drivers command premium value due to the dangerous nature of mountain travel." Tharvin had purchased Killeth at age 28, recognizing capabilities that made her worth more than field workers who required only strength and endurance. He had forced her westward with 36 other enslaved people, the journey claiming 7 lives before reaching Colorado Territory. where mountains and distance from established slave markets made escape attempts virtually impossible. Even enslaved people who succeeded in running away faced wilderness that killed those unfamiliar with its demands, and indigenous peoples who had been decimated by disease and violence brought by the same white settlers who claimed land and people with equal disregard for existing rights. For 8 years, Caliph had driven Tharvan along mountain roads, her value increasing with every successful journey that proved her skills exceeded those of any driver he could have hired. He paid her nothing, fed her minimally, housed her in quarters that leaked during rainstorms, and beat her when moods or circumstances made violence seem appropriate. But he taught her the mountain roads, never realizing that knowledge could become a weapon in hands, patient enough to wait for the perfect moment. Every journey had been reconnaissance, every curve memorized, every dangerous section catalogued for future reference that Tharvan never suspected served purposes beyond his immediate travel needs. The Devil's Elbow represented the culmination of 8 years of planning that began the moment Caliph first saw where the road narrowed to barely 6 feet, with nothing but empty air beyond. She had driven past this location dozens of times, always imagining what would happen if a carriage left the road at precisely this point, calculating trajectories and probabilities with mathematical precision that free people attributed only to educated men, while denying that enslaved women possessed equivalent intellectual capabilities. Tonight, August 17, 1852, all that planning would be tested against reality that offered no second chances and accepted no excuses for failure. The carriage sat motionless on the Devil's Elbow, its wheels positioned 18 inches from the cliff edge where the road disappeared into darkness that promised no mercy for mistakes or miscalculations. Inside the cabin, Marcus Tharvan's patience had expired with the suddenness of a match-striking flint. "Why have we stopped?" His voice carried the particular irritation of a man accustomed to immediate obedience from people he refused to recognize as human. "We should reach Silverton by dawn if we maintain proper pace." Caliph sat frozen in the driver's seat, her hands still gripping reins that connected her to horses, now stamping nervously at the unexpected halt. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times over the past 3 years, refining every detail until the plan existed as clearly as memories of her daughter's face before she was sold away to Mississippi cotton fields. "The left horse is favoring her rear leg, sir," Caliph replied with the carefully neutral tone that enslaved people perfected to avoid punishment for showing insufficient deference or excessive personality. "I fear she may have picked up a stone. It would be dangerous to continue without checking." This was a lie, carefully constructed from observations of Tharvan's priorities that valued his property, including horses, above human considerations. A lame horse meant delays and veterinary expenses that offended his sense of efficiency. He would accept a brief stop to address mechanical problems even while resenting the interruption to his schedule. The carriage door opened with the brass hinges that cost more than most families earned in a month. Tharvan emerged into mountain air that had cooled to a temperature that made breath visible, his expensive coat pulled tight against the chill that accompanied altitude even in August. "This is unacceptable," he announced to no one in particular, his words directed more at the universe than at Caliph, who had learned years ago that masters often talked to enslaved people as if addressing furniture that happened to possess ears. "I specifically instructed the stable master to ensure both horses were sound before departure." From Tharvan's business correspondence dated August 10, 1852. "Time is critical for the Silverton acquisition. Every delay risks losing water rights to competitors who lack my vision, but possess adequate capital to exploit my hesitation. I must reach the property by August 18th to finalize contracts before rival bidders present alternative offers." The timeline explained his insistence on night travel, despite dangers that multiplied in darkness, when drivers couldn't see obstacles until too late to avoid them. Tharvan gambled his safety on Caliph's skills, never comprehending that competence and loyalty were entirely separate qualities, and that 8 years of patient suffering had forged determination stronger than any iron chains he could have designed. Caliph descended from the driver's seat with movements that appeared reluctant, as if she dreaded the examination that would reveal her deception. She approached the left horse slowly, making calming sounds that she had learned during childhood from her mother, who had possessed knowledge of animal handling that predated enslavement, but proved useful enough that masters allowed its practice while claiming credit for any successes. The horse nuzzled her shoulder, recognizing someone who had fed and cared for these animals with attention that exceeded what Tharvin ever provided for the human beings he claimed as property. Horses received veterinary care, adequate food, and shelter from weather that could damage valuable animals. Enslaved people received whatever minimum provision kept them functional enough to generate profit. "I need to lift her hoof to examine the shoe," Caliph said, her voice carrying just enough concern to sound authentic while avoiding the panic that might make Tharvin suspicious. "The road is narrow here. Perhaps you should wait in the carriage where it's safer." This was the critical moment, the pivot point, where Tharvin's decision would determine whether the plan could proceed or required abandonment until some future opportunity that might never arrive. Caliph kept her eyes downcast in the submissive posture that white masters interpreted as natural deference, rather than recognizing it as performance refined through decades of surviving by appearing less threatening than they actually were. Tharvin glanced at the cliff edge, calculating risks with the same cold assessment he applied to business ventures that treated human lives as acceptable losses in pursuit of profit margins. The drop disappeared into darkness where moonlight couldn't reach, revealing nothing of the canyon floor except the distant sound of water running over rocks worn smooth by millennia of erosion. "Be quick about it," he ordered, stepping away from the carriage but remaining outside rather than returning to the cabin's relative safety. "We've already lost valuable time with this delay." His decision sealed his fate, though he couldn't possibly know that the enslaved woman examining a horse's hoof possessed plans that had been refined through 3 years of patient observation and preparation. Caliph had waited for the perfect combination of circumstances: night travel, a dangerous road section, weather conditions that would cover her tracks, and Tharvin's documented urgency to reach Silverton before competitors could interfere with his expansion plans. She bent to lift the horse's hoof, positioning herself between the animal and the carriage in a stance that appeared focused on veterinary examination, but actually provided the leverage she would need for what came next. Her fingers traced the shoe's edge, feeling for damage that didn't exist, while her mind counted seconds until Tharvin's impatience would override his caution. The night air carried sounds that white settlers never learned to interpret: the call of an owl hunting in darkness, the rustle of wind through pine trees that had witnessed human drama for centuries before Europeans arrived, the distant howl of a wolf pack coordinating their hunt with communication that required no written language but achieved perfect understanding. Caliph had learned these sounds during her years in Colorado, recognizing patterns that connected her to landscapes that existed beyond white control. The mountains cared nothing for property deeds or ownership claims. They recognized only the ancient laws of gravity and consequences that applied equally to everyone regardless of the color of their skin or the chains they wore. "The shoe appears intact," Caliph announced after a delay calculated to seem thorough without triggering Tharvin's suspicion that she might be stalling for purposes beyond legitimate concern for the horse's soundness. Perhaps she simply stumbled on loose stone. "I believe we can continue safely." She released the horse's hoof and straightened slowly, her movements betraying none of the tension coiling in muscles that had been strengthened by 8 years of physical labor that Tharvin never acknowledged as requiring effort or skill. Her position now placed her directly beside the carriage door, close enough to reach the handle before Tharvin could react, if reaction even occurred to a man who had never imagined that property might revolt. "Then let us proceed immediately," Tharvin commanded, turning toward the carriage door with the casual assumption that his words would be obeyed because they had always been obeyed, because the system of slavery had taught him that power required only assertion to achieve compliance. He had learned nothing about the difference between submission and patience, between obedience and performance, between control and the illusion of control that lasted only until someone decided the cost of rebellion was worth paying. Caliph's hand closed around the carriage door handle at exactly 11:47 p.m., the moment when everything that had come before would be erased by what happened next. Time slowed to the pace of honey dripping from a spoon as Kayla's fingers tightened around the brass door handle. The metal felt cold against her palm, smooth from years of Tharvin's grip, as he entered and exited this carriage that cost more than the combined value of every enslaved person he claimed as property. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, loud enough that she feared Tharvin might hear it, and recognized the sound of rebellion disguised as obedience. Marcus Tharvin reached for the carriage step, his expensive leather boot-finding purchase on the iron footrest that had been polished that morning by another enslaved woman whose name he had never bothered to learn. His attention focused on entering the cabin and resuming the journey that would expand his empire at the cost of 50 more human beings forced into tobacco fields. where heat and brutality killed slower than bullets but just as certainly. He never saw Calith's left hand release the door handle and move to the brake lever that kept the carriage stationary on the narrow mountain road. The Devil's Elbow curved like a sickle blade at this elevation, the road narrowing to barely 6 feet of packed earth bordered by the cliff face on one side and absolute emptiness on the other. Local drivers approached this section with prayers and caution, reducing speed until horses barely walked, giving the animals time to feel their way along a path that forgave no errors. The wooden safety posts that marked the outer edge had been placed by territorial surveyors who measured distances but never understood the living geometry of stone and space. Calith had memorized everything about this location during 17 previous journeys. The angle of the curve that would determine trajectory once the carriage left the road, the distance from the cliff edge to the first outcropping that might arrest a falling vehicle, the depth of the gorge that guaranteed no survival for anyone inside a carriage that completed the 1,000-foot descent to the Colorado River below. She knew that the brake lever required 12 pounds of pressure to release, that the horses would need 3 seconds to register the carriage's sudden freedom before instinct made them try to pull away from the weight dragging them backward, that Tharvin would need 2 seconds to comprehend what was happening and another 3 to attempt any response that might prevent his death. 8 seconds total, the time between one breath and the last breath Marcus Tharvin would ever draw. From a letter written by territorial surveyor James Whitmore dated June 1849, the Devil's Elbow presents the most dangerous section of the Silverton route. I recommend widening the road to a minimum of 10 feet, installing reinforced barriers, and posting warning signs visible from sufficient distance to allow drivers to reduce speed. Without these improvements, I predict multiple fatalities as traffic increases with continued settlement and commercial development. The territorial legislature had reviewed Whitmore's recommendations, calculated the cost of implementing his suggestions, and decided that the expense exceeded their budget. 3 drivers had died at the Devil's Elbow since then, their deaths recorded as unfortunate accidents rather than predictable consequences of refusing to invest in safety measures that protected human lives. Tonight would add one more death to that count, though this one would be neither unfortunate nor accidental. Calith's hand moved to the brake lever at 11:47 p.m. on August 17, 1852, her fingers wrapping around wood worn smooth by thousands of applications and releases. The lever represented the only thing preventing 2,000 pounds of carriage and cargo from responding to gravity's patient invitation. She had touched this lever countless times during 8 years of driving, always applying it, never releasing it without Tharvin's explicit or implied permission. This time would be different. Tharvin had one foot on the carriage step and one hand gripping the door frame when Calith released the brake with a motion so smooth it might have been mistaken for accident if anyone had survived to question what happened next. The lever moved through its arc with the silence of well-maintained machinery, offering no warning except the barely audible click as metal disengaged from the wheel mechanism it had been restraining. For one suspended heartbeat, nothing changed. The carriage remained motionless, balanced between forward momentum and backward gravity, a moment of perfect equilibrium that existed outside normal time. Then physics asserted its authority with the inevitability of sunrise. The carriage rolled backward 6 inches before the horses registered the change in weight distribution. Their ears flattened against their heads as they felt the vehicle pulling them toward the cliff edge, instinct screaming warnings that made them plant their hooves and resist with strength built from years of hauling loads across mountain terrain. But 2 horses, however strong, could not hold 2,000 pounds of carriage on a slight downward grade once momentum had been established. The iron-shod wheels began turning backward, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as gravity overcame friction, and the carriage accelerated toward the cliff edge 18 inches behind its rear axle. Tharvin's face transformed from irritation to confusion to comprehension to terror in the space of 3 seconds. His mouth opened to scream orders, commands, anything that might restore the control he had exercised without question for 32 years of treating human beings as property subject to his absolute authority. Stop! The brake! Pull the brake! His voice carried the particular panic of a man discovering that power was always borrowed, never owned, and could be revoked by anyone willing to pay the price of rebellion. He lunged for the driver's seat where Calith stood motionless, watching the carriage roll backward with the detached calm of someone who had already calculated every outcome and accepted all consequences. Kalith stepped away from the driver's seat with movements economical and precise, her body flowing sideways as Tharvan's grasping hand found only empty air where she had been standing. She landed on the road surface in a crouch that absorbed impact while maintaining balance, her eyes never leaving the carriage that now rolled backward with increasing speed. The horses screamed as their hooves lost purchase on the packed earth, their bodies pulled inexorably toward the cliff edge by weight they could not resist. Kalith had unhitched the harness connections during her supposed examination of the left horse's hoof, a detail Tharvan had been too impatient to notice, as he fumed about delays threatening his business timeline. The leather straps separated from the carriage with sounds like bones breaking, freeing the horses to scramble away from the edge while the vehicle continued its backward journey without them. The animals bolted forward along the road, their survival instinct overriding any training that might have kept them near the carriage that had represented their entire existence for years. Tharvan threw himself toward the driver's seat in a desperate attempt to reach the brake lever that could still arrest the carriage's momentum if applied immediately. His fingers grasped the edge of the wooden seat, finding purchase that lasted exactly long enough to give him hope before the carriage's rear wheels dropped over the cliff edge and everything changed. The vehicle tilted backward with the slow grace of a ship sinking into deep water, its front wheels lifting from the road as weight distribution shifted beyond any recovery point. Tharvan's grip on the driver's seat became an anchor dragging him into the abyss, his body sliding backward into the cabin as the carriage stood nearly vertical for one frozen moment. What would you choose if freedom meant watching another human being plunge to their death, while you stood close enough to touch them but far enough to survive? Kalith stood on solid ground 6 feet from the cliff edge, her body trembling not with fear, but with the release of 8 years of tension that had coiled tighter with each passing day of forced submission. She watched Tharvan's face through the carriage window, saw his eyes meet hers in a moment of recognition that crossed the void between master and property, destroyer and destroyed, human and human. Then gravity completed its work, pulling the carriage backward over the edge with finality that accepted no appeals or negotiations. The vehicle disappeared into darkness accompanied by sounds that would echo in Kalith's memory for the rest of her life. The screaming of wood and metal under stress, the crash of breaking glass, the fading cry of a man who had bought and sold human beings discovering that death recognized no distinctions of ownership or status. The night swallowed Marcus Tharvan in his luxury carriage, erasing both from the visible world as completely as he had erased the humanity of 17 people, whose names appeared in his ledgers as property requiring management, rather than individuals deserving recognition. Kalith stood alone on the Devil's Elbow at 11:48 p.m. on August 17, 1852, listening to echoes fade into silence broken only by wind through pine trees, and the distant sound of water that would soon receive wreckage carrying the remains of a man who had believed that power was permanent and control was absolute. She had exactly 8 hours until dawn revealed her actions to anyone passing this remote section of mountain road. 8 hours to implement the second phase of a plan that went far beyond one master's death, reaching toward liberation that would free 17 souls still enslaved at Blackstone Ridge plantation. But first, she needed to catch 2 terrified horses. The horses had bolted 50 yards up the road before their panic subsided enough for survival instinct to override terror. Kalith found them pressed against the cliff face where the road widened slightly, their flanks heaving with exertion and fear, their eyes rolling white in the moonlight that painted everything in shades of silver and shadow. She approached slowly, making the same calming sounds her mother had taught her before memory became fragmented by sails that scattered families like seeds thrown on barren ground. The animals recognized her voice, her scent, the particular gentleness she had always shown them, even when Tharvan stood watching and expecting the harsh treatment he considered appropriate for property that existed only to serve his purposes. The left horse, a mare named Duchess by stable workers who were forbidden from naming human beings but encouraged to personalize valuable animals, lowered her head and allowed Kalith to grasp her bridle. The right horse, a gelding called Baron, followed his companion's lead, accepting human contact from someone who had never used the whip that hung from the driver's seat as threat or punishment. "Easy now," Kalith whispered, running her hands along their necks, feeling for injuries that might have occurred during their desperate scramble away from the cliff edge. Both animals appeared sound despite their panic, another element of the plan that had succeeded beyond her most optimistic projections. She had gambled that releasing the harness connections would allow the horses to escape before the carriage's weight pulled them over the edge. Draft animals were expensive, valued at $300 each, and their survival meant resources she could use for the journey ahead. More importantly, they represented living proof that the carriage accident had been exactly that, an unfortunate mechanical failure rather than deliberate sabotage by an enslaved woman who possessed far more intelligence and determination than her master had ever recognized. From a journal entry by Dr. Samuel Peterson, physician serving mining camps along the Silverton route, dated August 1851, mountain roads claim victims with depressing regularity. I have treated 17 cases of injuries sustained in carriage accidents over the past year, and presided over the burial of 9 individuals whose remains could be recovered from canyon floors. The territorial government's refusal to invest in road improvements guarantees these tragedies will continue until public outcry forces action that common sense should have prompted years ago. Caliph led both horses further up the road to where a small clearing provided space to assess her situation and plan the next steps that would determine whether tonight's action represented the beginning of freedom or simply a different form of death sentence. She tied the animals to a pine tree using rope from the emergency supplies every mountain carriage carried, then allowed herself the first moment of stillness since she had released the brake lever and transformed herself from property to fugitive. Her hands shook with delayed reaction, muscles releasing tension that had kept them steady through actions requiring precision that allowed no margin for error. She pressed her palms against her thighs, willing them to stillness while her mind raced through calculations that would determine survival probabilities for the next 8 hours, the next 8 days, the next 8 years if she managed to evade capture that long. The reality of what she had done settled over her like physical weight. Marcus Tharvin was dead, his body broken at the bottom of Devil's Throat Gorge, along with the carriage that had carried him on business ventures across 3 territories. His death would trigger investigations, search parties, consequences that would ripple through the territorial administration and the enslaved community at Blackstone Ridge Plantation. But investigations required time, and time was exactly what Caliph had purchased with tonight's actions. Tharvin had told no one except his business partner about this journey-specific route or timeline. The territorial authorities expected him in Silverton by August 18th, but his failure to arrive would initially be attributed to the same delays that plagued all mountain travel, mechanical problems or weather conditions, or simple miscalculation of journey time. Days, perhaps even a week, might pass before anyone organized serious search efforts. By then, Caliph intended to be far from Colorado territory, traveling toward freedom that existed somewhere beyond the reach of slave catchers and fugitive laws that treated escaped human property as theft requiring return to rightful owners. She reached into the pocket of her dress, feeling for the items she had hidden there before beginning tonight's journey. Her fingers closed around folded papers that represented the difference between impossible dreams and achievable goals, documents she had stolen from Tharvin's study over the course of 18 months. Removing 1 page at a time during cleaning duties that required her presence in spaces where white masters kept records they assumed were safe from enslaved eyes. The first document was a map of the Western Territories, hand-drawn by a surveyor who had marked routes, settlements, and distances with the precision that careful observation provided. Caliph had memorized this map during stolen moments, when Tharvin left his study to attend to other matters, tracing routes that led away from slave states and toward territories where freedom existed not as abstract concept, but as legal reality for those who could reach them. The second document was a letter of passage, forged using Tharvin's own stationery and seal, identifying the bearer as a free woman of color traveling under the protection and authority of Marcus Tharvin himself. The forgery had required 3 attempts before she achieved handwriting that matched Tharvin's distinctive style, practiced during nights when exhaustion made sleep impossible and determination made failure unacceptable. The third document was the deed to Blackstone Ridge Plantation, stolen 2 weeks earlier when Tharvin had requested her presence in his study to discuss expansion plans that would require additional enslaved workers to cultivate fields that stretched beyond current boundaries. He had spread papers across his desk, never imagining that the property standing before him might possess both the literacy to understand legal documents and the audacity to steal one, while he described how her labor would contribute to profits she would never share. From a legal notice published in the Denver Territorial Gazette, dated September 3, 1852, reward offered for information regarding the disappearance of Marcus Tharvin, prominent planter last seen departing Denver on August 17. Additional reward offered for the capture and return of an enslaved woman named Calith, approximately 36 years of age, suspected of involvement in Tharvin's disappearance. Contact Territorial Marshal's office with any information. But that notice would not appear for another 16 days, time Calith intended to use traveling toward California, where recent legal changes had created complicated opportunities for enslaved people willing to risk everything for freedom that might last only until the next fugitive slave law revision. She stood in the clearing at 12:13 a.m. on August 18, 1852, listening to horses breathing and wind moving through trees that had witnessed human drama for centuries before tonight, added one more chapter to the endless story of those who refused to accept that their humanity could be reduced to property status by laws written by people who benefited from that reduction. The plan had worked perfectly so far, but perfection was a luxury that rarely survived contact with reality's infinite complications. Calith needed to reach Blackstone Ridge plantation before dawn, needed to warn the other enslaved people that their master was dead and that consequences were coming whether they prepared or not. Most importantly, she needed to offer them a choice that Tharvin had spent 8 years denying: the opportunity to risk everything for freedom that might exist somewhere beyond the mountains that rose like barriers between current suffering and possible salvation. The ride back to Blackstone Ridge plantation took 3 hours through mountain darkness that concealed more than just the road ahead. Calith pushed the horses harder than wisdom recommended, knowing that every minute brought her closer to dawn and the discovery that would transform tonight's action from secret justice into public crime, requiring response from territorial authorities. The plantation appeared at 3:47 a.m. as a collection of dark shapes against darker landscape, the main house rising 3 stories toward stars that had witnessed the construction of empires built on stolen labor and stolen land. Outbuildings clustered around the mansion like subjects attending a king. The curing barns where tobacco hung in fragrant rows, the processing facility where enslaved hands prepared crops for markets that would never acknowledge their essential contribution, the quarters where 17 human beings slept in conditions that Tharvin's horses would have rejected as inadequate. Calith guided the animals past the main house toward the stables, her approach silent enough to avoid waking the plantation's overseer, a man named Joseph Taylor who lived in a cottage positioned to observe the quarters and ensure that enslaved people remained contained during hours when darkness might have provided cover for escape attempts that daylight made virtually impossible. Taylor had been hired 6 months earlier after his predecessor died from injuries sustained during a confrontation with an enslaved man who refused additional punishment for the crime of looking tired after 16 hours of fieldwork. The replacement overseer brought a reputation for efficient brutality, maintaining control through calculated violence that broke spirits without damaging bodies enough to reduce market value or work capacity. But Taylor slept soundly tonight, his confidence in chains and fear allowing him rest that Calith had not experienced in 8 years of forced servitude. She secured the horses in their stalls, providing water and feed that the animals had earned through their performance tonight, then moved through shadows toward the quarters where 16 people waited without knowing that their world had just been transformed by actions they hadn't witnessed, but would soon experience as consequences that couldn't be avoided. The quarters consisted of a single long building divided into 8 rooms, each measuring 12 feet square and housing 2 people in conditions that the territorial housing inspector had noted as adequate for the accommodation of laborers who require minimal comfort to maintain productive output. The inspector's report made no mention of the gaps in the walls where winter wind entered freely, the roof that leaked during rainstorms, or the complete absence of heating except what occupants could generate through their own body warmth during mountain nights that regularly dropped below freezing. Calith entered through the door that never locked because Tharvin considered locks unnecessary for people who had nowhere to run and no resources to sustain flight even if they attempted it. The interior smelled of unwashed bodies and despair. scents that became invisible to those who lived with them constantly but struck visitors as evidence of conditions that reduced human beings to animals requiring only minimal maintenance. She moved to the first room where Evelyn Thomas and Abigail Anderson slept on pallets, stuffed with straw that needed replacing but wouldn't receive it until the tobacco harvest was complete, and Tharvin had time to consider expenses unrelated to immediate profit generation. Both women had worked the plantation fields for 6 years, their hands scarred by tobacco leaves that left residue requiring daily scrubbing with lye soap that burned skin, already damaged by sun exposure and chemical irritation. "Evelyn," Calith whispered, touching the woman's shoulder with pressure calculated to wake without startling. "I need you to wake up, something has happened." Evelyn came awake with the instant alertness of someone accustomed to midnight summons that rarely brought good news. Her eyes found Calith's face in the darkness, reading something there that made her sit upright with movements careful not to disturb Abigail, who continued sleeping with the deep exhaustion that came from labor that consumed every reserve of physical energy. "What's wrong?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely audible above the sound of breathing from other rooms where 14 people slept without knowing that their morning would arrive carrying news that changed everything. "Tharvin is dead," Calith stated with directness that circumstances required. There was no gentle way to deliver information this significant, no diplomatic phrasing that would soften the reality of what had occurred and what would follow. His carriage went over the cliff at Devil's Elbow. There were no witnesses except me. The implications hung in the air between them, heavy with meanings that didn't require verbal elaboration. Evelyn's face cycled through expressions that reflected the complexity of responding to news that a master had died, relief competing with fear of consequences that would inevitably follow, hope wrestling with the learned pessimism that came from years of disappointment that taught enslaved people not to expect justice or mercy from systems designed to provide neither. "Did you?" Evelyn began, then stopped, reconsidering whether she wanted to complete the question or preferred the protection that ignorance might provide if territorial authorities began interrogating everyone who had been present at the plantation when Tharvin disappeared. "It doesn't matter what I did or didn't do," Calith interrupted, understanding the calculation behind Evelyn's hesitation. "What matters is that we have maybe 3 days, possibly a week before his business partners notice he missed his Silverton meeting and organize search parties. After that, everything changes in ways we can't control unless we act now." From a territorial statute enacted in 1850, upon the death of a property owner, all assets including livestock, equipment, and enslaved persons shall be held in trust pending resolution of estate matters. Enslaved persons may not be sold or relocated until ownership questions have been legally resolved, a process typically requiring 6 to 18 months depending on the complexity of the deceased's financial affairs. The law created a window of opportunity that Calith had been studying since she first stole Tharvin's estate documents and discovered the labyrinthine complexity of his financial arrangements. He owed money to banks in Denver and St. Louis, had partnership agreements with 3 other planters, maintained accounts with merchants across 2 territories. Settling his estate would require months of legal proceedings during which his enslaved people would remain at Blackstone Ridge under minimal supervision, while lawyers argued over assets and debts. Months meant time to plan, organize, and execute escapes that isolated individuals could never accomplish, but coordinated groups might achieve if they possessed resources, information, and the collective determination to risk everything for freedom that existed somewhere beyond the reach of laws that treated human beings as property subject to ownership and control. "I'm going to wake everyone," Calith announced, her voice carrying the authority that came from having already crossed lines that the others had only imagined crossing. "They need to hear this together, need to make decisions together. What happens next affects all of us." She moved through the quarters systematically, waking 16 people with words that shattered sleep and transformed their reality in the space between one breath and the next. The responses varied according to temperament and experience. Some showed immediate relief at news of Tharvin's death. Others displayed fear of consequences. A few remained silent as they processed information too significant to absorb immediately. Within 20 minutes, all 16 enslaved people sat crowded into the largest room, their faces illuminated by a single candle that Calith had lit, despite Tharvin's rule forbidding fires in the quarters after dark. The flame cast dancing shadows across walls that had contained their suffering for years but might not contain them much longer if courage could be found to match the opportunity that Tharvan's death had created. "We have a choice," Caliph began, holding up the documents she had stolen over 18 months of patient theft. "We can wait for whatever happens when his estate gets settled, hope that whoever inherits us is less brutal than he was. Or we can use the time before anyone realizes what happened to organize an escape that gives us real chances at freedom." She spread the surveyor's map across the floor, its lines and markings visible in the candlelight that revealed routes leading away from Colorado territory toward California, Oregon, and other destinations where slavery existed in complicated legal spaces that offered possibilities for those willing to navigate them. "Tharvan kept detailed records of everything he owned," Caliph continued, producing the plantation deed and other documents that proved ownership of land, equipment, and human beings valued at thousands of dollars in markets that treated people like livestock. "These papers can be our weapons if we're smart about using them. His business partners don't know he's dead yet. His accounts are still active. His credit is still good at merchants across 2 territories." Logan Martinez, a man who had been enslaved at Blackstone Ridge for 9 years, leaned forward to study the map with intensity that suggested he was already calculating routes and possibilities. "You're talking about stealing supplies, forging documents, impersonating free people, traveling on legitimate business. That's not escape, that's warfare against the entire system." "Yes," Caliph agreed without hesitation. "Because anything less than warfare against the entire system means we stay property forever. Or until we're too broken to work and get sold to someone who squeezes the last value from used-up slaves before they die. I've seen what this life does to people. I won't accept it anymore." The candle flame guttered in a draft that entered through gaps in the walls, its movement creating shadows that made the assembled faces appear to shift between hope and despair, determination and resignation, courage and the learned helplessness that came from years of having every attempt at dignity crushed by people who considered enslaved resistance as property malfunction, requiring correction through violence. "What would you risk if freedom meant trusting 16 people with your life and asking them to trust you with theirs?" The question hung in the air as Caliph waited for responses that would determine whether Tharvan's death became the beginning of liberation, or simply another tragedy in the long history of enslaved people who dared to imagine they deserved better than the lives that had been forced upon them. The decision came not as unanimous declaration, but as gradual consensus built from 16 individual choices made in the flickering candlelight of a room that had witnessed years of suffering, but never this particular flavor of hope mixed with terror. By 4:33 a.m. on August 18, 1852, every enslaved person at Blackstone Ridge Plantation had committed to a plan that transformed them from property waiting for new owners into fugitives actively pursuing freedom that might cost them everything. The preparation moved with efficiency born from urgency that allowed no wasted motion or unnecessary debate. Caliph divided responsibilities according to skills that Tharvan had valued when they served his purposes, but never imagined might be turned against the system he represented. Logan Martinez and Ryan Robinson, both experienced with plantation accounts from years of being forced to track crop yields and equipment maintenance, would forge documents establishing them as free men of color traveling on business authorized by Marcus Tharvan. The irony of using the dead master's authority to facilitate their escape was not lost on anyone present. But irony was a luxury that circumstances didn't permit them to fully appreciate. Evelyn Thomas and Hannah Clark, whose domestic service experience included managing household supplies and coordinating meal preparation for Tharvan's business entertaining, would inventory the plantation's resources and identify what could be taken without immediately alerting the overseer that systematic theft had occurred. Food stores, clothing, tools, anything portable enough to carry and valuable enough to trade, would be gathered during the next 48 hours, while Joseph Taylor remained unaware that his charges had transformed from docile property into organized resistance. The remaining 12 enslaved people would maintain normal routines, working fields, and performing duties exactly as they had for years, creating the appearance of business as usual, while the foundation of Tharvan's empire crumbled beneath the surface like a mountain riddled with mines that would eventually collapse under their own weight. "We move in 3 groups, Caliph explained, using a stick to draw lines in the dirt floor that represented roots branching away from Blackstone Ridge like tributaries flowing from a poisoned source. The first group leaves tomorrow night, traveling toward Denver where they can blend into the free black community while preparing documents for the next phase. The second group departs 2 days later, heading southwest toward Santa Fe, where Spanish law creates complications that might work in our favor. The third group stays here 1 more week, maintaining appearances until the other groups are far enough away that pursuit becomes impossible to coordinate effectively. From a letter written by abolitionist minister Reverend William Hayes, dated July 1852, the Western Territories present both dangers and opportunities for those fleeing bondage. While slavery exists legally in some regions, the vast distances and limited law enforcement resources create spaces where determined fugitives can establish new lives if they possess the intelligence and courage required to navigate complex legal and social landscapes. I have personally assisted 17 formerly enslaved individuals in reaching California, where their status remains precarious but infinitely preferable to the certain brutality they escaped. The plan relied on Tharvin's extensive business network becoming its own undoing. He had established credit with merchants across Colorado Territory, maintained accounts with suppliers in 3 states, corresponded with partners who trusted his word and accepted his authority. The documents Caliph had stolen provided templates for forgeries that would allow enslaved people to access those resources during the critical window before Tharvin's death became public knowledge. It was audacious beyond reason, requiring coordination across vast distances, perfect timing, and luck that people born into slavery had learned never to expect from a universe that had shown them nothing but systematic cruelty disguised as economic necessity. But audacity was exactly what circumstances demanded, because cautious approaches had achieved nothing except prolonging suffering that would continue until someone decided that impossible goals were worth pursuing regardless of probable failure. The first test came at 6:15 a.m. when Joseph Taylor emerged from his cottage and rang the bell that summoned enslaved workers to another day of labor that would profit everyone except those who performed it. The 16 people who had spent the night planning revolution filed from their quarters with the same exhausted compliance they had demonstrated every morning for years, their faces showing nothing of the determination that burned beneath performances perfected through necessity. Taylor watched them assemble with the bored attention of a man who had stopped seeing individuals years ago, his eyes registering only bodies that needed to be distributed across fields requiring cultivation, irrigation, and harvest preparation. He noted absences or irregularities with the mechanical precision of someone tracking inventory rather than supervising human beings, his ledger recording each person's presence or absence, without acknowledging that such records documented the systematic theft of human potential. "Where's Caliph?" Taylor asked, his voice carrying the irritation of someone whose routine had been disrupted by an absence that required explanation and possibly punishment. "Master Tharvin took her on the Silverton trip," Evelyn responded with the careful neutrality that enslaved people perfected to avoid punishment for showing insufficient deference or excessive personality. "They should return by week's end." The lie required no elaboration because Taylor possessed neither the curiosity nor the authority to question Tharvin's travel arrangements. The overseer grunted acknowledgement and began assigning work details, his attention already moving past the irregularity toward the day's labor requirements that needed to be met, regardless of who was present or absent. Inside the main house, Caliph moved through rooms she had cleaned 1,000 times, her presence now transformed from servant maintaining her master's property into thief systematically looting resources that would fund liberation for 16 people who had collectively decided that death while pursuing freedom was preferable to life spent generating profits for people who refused to acknowledge their humanity. Bade. Tharvin's study yielded the most valuable treasures: blank stationery bearing his personal seal, business correspondence that revealed the protocols and language used in commercial transactions, account books showing exactly how much credit he maintained with various merchants and suppliers. She worked quickly, selecting items that would be missed only after thorough inventory that wouldn't occur until estate lawyers began cataloging assets for distribution among creditors and heirs. The bedroom provided clothing that could be altered to fit men and women attempting to pass as free people traveling on legitimate business. Tharvin's wardrobe contained suits worth more than most enslaved people earned in lifetimes of forced labor, their quality announcing status that opened doors and discouraged the kind of casual questioning that poorly dressed fugitives attracted from suspicious authorities. The library offered maps, travel guides, and correspondence with business contacts across Western Territories. Each document represented intelligence that fugitives could use to navigate landscapes designed to trap them. Information about which communities welcomed black residents and which enforced slave codes with enthusiasm that exceeded legal requirements. By 9:47 a.m., Caliph had assembled a collection of materials that transformed impossible dreams into achievable goals. Assuming everything went perfectly, and luck favored people who had received nothing but misfortune from a universe that seemed designed to crush anyone born with dark skin in a country that had built its prosperity on their systematic exploitation. She stood in Tharvin's study holding documents that could free 16 people or get them killed, the weight of both possibilities pressing down with force that made breathing difficult. Outside, the plantation continued its daily routine, tobacco plants growing in fields tended by people who didn't own the crops they cultivated, the main house standing as monument to wealth generated by labor that would never be fairly compensated. The morning sun climbed higher over Blackstone Ridge, illuminating a landscape that appeared unchanged from countless previous days. But appearances deceived, because beneath the surface of normality, revolution was organizing itself with the patient determination of people who had learned that freedom required planning, courage, and the willingness to risk everything for possibilities that might exist somewhere beyond the mountains that rose, like barriers between current suffering and potential salvation. From a diary entry by Emma Whitfield, a free black woman living in Denver, dated August 1852, more refugees arrive weekly, their numbers increasing as word spreads that the Western Territories offer opportunities despite the dangers. I provide what assistance I can, knowing that each person who reaches freedom represents victory against a system designed to ensure they remain property forever. The work is dangerous and the success rate is heartbreaking, but the alternative is accepting that some human beings deserve bondage while others deserve liberty, a premise I reject with every fiber of my being. The first group would depart in 14 hours, carrying forged documents and stolen resources toward an uncertain future that offered the only thing worth having, the possibility of living as human beings rather than property subject to ownership and control by people who would never acknowledge their essential humanity. Caliph returned to the quarters at 11:52 a.m. with bags containing everything 16 people would need to attempt the impossible. The transformation from enslaved property to free people would require more than documents and supplies, would demand performances that convinced skeptical observers that former slaves possessed the confidence and bearing of individuals who had always been free. But if 8 years of driving Tharvin along mountain roads had taught her anything, it was that the most dangerous journeys required the steadiest hands and the clearest vision of destinations that existed beyond immediate obstacles. Tonight, the first group would begin their journey toward freedom that might exist somewhere beyond the reach of laws designed to ensure they remained property forever. Their success or failure would determine whether the other groups followed or remained at Blackstone Ridge, waiting for whatever fate new owners would impose upon people whose only crime was being born with skin color that white society had decided justified their perpetual enslavement. Ancho. The first group departed Blackstone Ridge Plantation at 11:47 p.m. on August 18, 1852, exactly 24 hours after Marcus Tharvin's carriage had disappeared over the cliff edge at Devil's Elbow. 6 people melted into mountain darkness carrying forged documents, stolen supplies, and the combined hope of 16 souls who had decided that freedom was worth any price that circumstances might demand. Logan Martinez and Ryan Robinson led the group, their forged papers identifying them as free men of color traveling on business for the Tharvin plantation, authorized to conduct transactions and make purchases on behalf of their employer. The documents bore Tharvin's seal and signature, perfectly replicated by hands that had practiced for months until the forgery became indistinguishable from authentic authorization. Behind them walked Evelyn Thomas and Hannah Clark, carrying bundles that appeared to contain trade goods but actually held everything 6 people would need to survive 2 weeks of travel toward Denver, where free black communities offered the possibility of disappearing into populations large enough to absorb newcomers without attracting the kind of attention that isolated fugitives inevitably drew from slave catchers and suspicious authorities. The second group followed 2 nights later, their route diverging southwest toward Santa Fe, where Spanish legal traditions created complicated jurisdictions that American slave laws hadn't fully penetrated. 8 people traveling in pairs, their separation reducing the visibility that large groups attracted while maintaining enough mutual support to handle emergencies that solo fugitives couldn't survive. Calith remained at Blackstone Ridge with Abigail Anderson, maintaining the appearance of normal operations while the overseer Joseph Taylor conducted his daily routines without recognizing that the plantation's enslaved population had been reduced from 17 to 2 through carefully staged departures that he attributed to work assignments in distant fields or temporary loans to neighboring plantations that Tharvin had supposedly arranged before his ill-fated journey. The deception held for 9 days. On August 27, 1852, territorial marshals arrived at Blackstone Ridge with questions about Marcus Tharvin's disappearance and suspicions that had been growing since his failure to appear at the Silverton meeting had prompted his business partners to organize search parties. The discovery of wreckage at the bottom of Devil's Throat Gorge had answered some questions while creating others that pointed toward possibilities authorities found difficult to accept. From the Territorial Marshal's report dated August 28, 1852, investigation of the Tharvin carriage accident reveals irregularities suggesting possible foul play. The harness connections show evidence of deliberate cutting rather than accidental failure. The brake mechanism was found in the released position despite the dangerous nature of the road section where the accident occurred. Most significantly, Tharvin's enslaved driver is missing, along with 14 other enslaved persons from the plantation, their disappearances timed suspiciously close to the discovery of their master's death. Warrants have been issued for the capture and return of all fugitives, with particular emphasis on apprehending the woman Calith, who is considered extremely dangerous and likely responsible for Tharvin's murder. But warrants required enforcement, and enforcement required finding fugitives who had scattered across 3 territories using forged documents that gave them weeks of head start before anyone realized they were missing. The territorial marshals organized pursuit with enthusiasm that exceeded their competence, searching in obvious directions while the fugitives traveled routes that careful planning had identified as offering the best chances of evading capture. By September 15, 1852, all pursuit efforts had been abandoned as futile exercises consuming resources that territorial authorities couldn't justify spending on property that had probably died in wilderness that killed even experienced travelers. The official conclusion classified the fugitives as lost rather than escaped, a distinction that allowed authorities to avoid acknowledging that enslaved people had orchestrated successful resistance against a system designed to make such resistance impossible. The truth proved far different from official conclusions. Logan Martinez and Ryan Robinson reached Denver on September 3rd, establishing themselves as free men operating a freight business that served mining camps scattered across mountain regions. Their forged documents withstood scrutiny from merchants who cared more about reliable service than investigating the backgrounds of black entrepreneurs who paid their debts and delivered goods as promised. Evelyn Thomas and Hannah Clark found work in Denver's growing domestic service economy, their skills making them valuable employees for households that asked few questions about workers who demonstrated competence and reliability. They sent carefully coded messages through the informal networks that connected free black communities, letting others know that destinations existed for those brave enough to attempt the journey. The second group scattered across New Mexico territory, some settling in Santa Fe where Spanish-speaking populations proved more welcoming than their Anglo counterparts, others pushing further west toward California, where recent legal changes had created ambiguous spaces that offered possibilities for those willing to navigate them. Calith herself disappeared completely from official records after September 1852. Some accounts claimed she reached California and established a freight business serving remote mining communities. Others suggested she traveled to Canada, where British law refused to recognize American slavery and provided sanctuary for fugitives willing to brave the northern journey. A few persistent rumors placed her back in Colorado territory, living among indigenous communities who had their own reasons for resisting the expansion that threatened their traditional lands. The truth, like so many truths about enslaved people who successfully escaped bondage, vanished into silence that official records never bothered to penetrate. Blackstone Ridge Plantation was eventually sold to satisfy Tharvin's debts, its new owners finding the property considerably less profitable without the enslaved labor force that had generated its original value. From a letter written by abolitionist Frederick Douglass, published in the North Star newspaper December 1852, recent reports from the Western Territories tell of enslaved people who have successfully escaped bondage through careful planning and extraordinary courage. While we cannot verify all details of these accounts, they serve as powerful reminders that the human spirit cannot be permanently bound by chains, no matter how strong those chains appear to those who forge them. Every successful escape represents not just individual liberation, but collective proof that slavery contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Even today, historians debate the details of what became known as the Blackstone Ridge escape, one of the most successful mass flights from slavery in Colorado territorial history. The official records remain incomplete, deliberately obscured by authorities who preferred not to document evidence of enslaved people, demonstrating the intelligence and organization that white society insisted they lacked. But in some communities, stories persist about a woman who drove her master's carriage off a cliff and then led 16 people to freedom through careful planning that turned the tools of oppression into instruments of liberation. On quiet nights in certain mountain towns, old-timers claim you can still hear the sound of carriage wheels approaching the Devil's Elbow, followed by silence that speaks louder than any scream. The story of Caliph Dramir reminds us that resistance takes many forms, and that justice sometimes arrives not through legal processes, but through the actions of individuals who decide that freedom is worth any risk, any sacrifice, any consequence that might follow from refusing to accept that some human beings deserve bondage while others deserve liberty. The carriage that burned at the bottom of Devil's Throat Gorge carried more than one man's body. It carried the remains of a system that depended on treating human beings as property. A system that collapsed the moment those human beings remembered. They possessed the intelligence, courage, and determination to fight back against forces that seemed overwhelming, until someone demonstrated they were not. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.